The email came on a Monday morning, 11 months and 3 days after they walked me out of the building. Dr. Petra Hoffman, Senior Regulatory Director at Veltman Pharma Group, Frankfurt. Her message was professional, precise, and 6 sentences long. She said her team had been conducting due diligence on Meridian Bioformulations' acquisition and had encountered something she needed to discuss with me directly. She asked if I was available for a call at 2 o'clock Eastern. I was sitting in the spare bedroom I'd converted into an office, drinking black coffee and reviewing a regulatory submission for a client in North Carolina. Outside the window, the New Jersey Turnpike hummed the way it always does in October, low and steady, like something that never quite stops. I looked at Petra's email for a long moment, then typed back, "Yes, I'm available." I knew exactly what she'd found. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm 53 years old, and I spent the last 22 years of my professional life making sure pharmaceutical companies didn't accidentally poison people, get shut down by federal regulators, or destroy themselves through paperwork negligence. Before that, I spent 9 years as a logistics officer in the United States Navy, where I learned that the difference between a plan working and a plan failing usually comes down to one thing: whether someone documented the handoff correctly. In pharmaceuticals, we call that regulatory continuity. It means that when a named authority leaves a role, the transfer of that authority has to be documented, filed with the FDA, and acknowledged before the vacancy date. It means there's no gray area, no assumption that things carry over automatically, no shortcut that doesn't eventually show up in an audit. It means the kind of work I did for 2 decades mattered every single day, even the quiet ones. Brandon Mercer didn't understand any of that. He showed up at Meridian Bioformulation 14 months ago as the new VP of Operational Excellence. The CEO, a man named Gerald Park, had brought him in. Gerald's daughter had married Brandon 2 years earlier, at a vineyard in Napa that I heard about through 3 different conversations I wasn't part of. Brandon had an MBA from a school I'd heard of, and a LinkedIn profile that listed him as a transformation architect, whatever that means for a company that manufactures sustained-release medications for hypertension and type 2 diabetes. He was 34 years old and had never worked in a regulated industry. The first time I sat in a meeting with him, he used the phrase frictionless efficiency 4 times in 20 minutes. He had one of those wireless presentation clickers that he kept clicking even when he wasn't advancing slides. He talked about Meridian's legacy cost structure, the way someone talks about a house they've decided to tear down. He hadn't asked anyone what the load-bearing walls were. My department was Quality Assurance and Regulatory Affairs, 16 people. We handled FDA correspondence, batch release documentation, CAPA systems, and the kind of ongoing compliance work that keeps a pharmaceutical manufacturer legally permitted to manufacture pharmaceuticals. I had been Meridian's named quality director on file with the FDA since the company's original facility registration in 2007. That designation wasn't symbolic. Under federal regulation 21 CFR Part 2, 111, every batch of drug product released from a regulated facility requires the signature or documented authorization of the named quality director. My name was on every batch record. My name was on every regulatory submission. My certification number was embedded in Meridian's facility license. Brandon's presentation called my department a legacy overhead structure with significant redundancy potential. He had a slide that showed my team's total compensation. He had a slide that compared us to a software platform he wanted to license. He did not have a slide that explained what would happen if the FDA received batch records signed by someone whose authority hadn't been formally designated. I watched him present and didn't say anything. Not because I didn't know what was coming, but because I understood something Brandon didn't. In regulated industries, the consequences of ignorance are not theoretical. They're written into the code of federal regulations, and they accrue whether you're paying attention or not. Gerald approved the restructuring 3 weeks later. My title became Senior Documentation Specialist. My access to the quality management system was restricted. My invitations to leadership meetings stopped. My team was reduced from 16 people to 4, and those 4 reported to a 26-year-old coordinator named Jess, who had been at the company for 10 months and had never submitted anything to the FDA in her life. Brandon called it right sizing. He sent a company-wide email about Meridian's exciting evolution toward data-driven operations. The part he didn't know, and that I didn't tell him, was this: changing the named quality director on file with the FDA is not an internal HR transaction. It requires a formal prior approval supplement or a changes being affected submission, depending on the nature of the product licenses involved. It requires the new designee to meet qualification standards. It requires documentation that the outgoing director has formally transferred authority. And under Meridian's own quality manual, a document I had authored and that Brandon had never read, any change to a named regulatory authority had to be completed and filed within 30 calendar days of the vacancy date, or the designation reverted to its last valid state, with all subsequent actions considered unauthorized. I had added that clause to the quality manual in 2019 after a competitor in Pennsylvania got hit with a consent decree because their quality director had retired without a proper handoff and nobody had caught it for 4 months. I went back to my reduced office, sat down, and opened a new binder. Not out of anger. Anger is a distraction. I opened it because documentation is what I know. And what I know is that when a company starts moving fast in the wrong direction, the responsible thing is to make sure the record is clear. I printed every version of my FDA designation letters going back to 2007. I printed the quality manual with section 8.4.2 tabbed and highlighted. I printed the batch release authorization matrix showing my name as sole signatory for all commercial products. I made 2 copies of everything. One went into a fireproof box at my house. The other went into a red binder labeled Regulatory Continuity for Reference, which I placed in the back of the document control archive room, bottom cabinet, second drawer. I dated the placement on the cover sheet and initialed it the way I would any controlled document. Then I waited. My resignation letter was 4 sentences. Effective in 30 days, no counteroffer considered, no exit interview, no speech. HR processed it while I was still in the building. Brandon sent me a Slack message that said all the best. Hugh M. He had apparently confused me with someone else, which I found fitting. Gerald never called. My son called that night. He's 27, works in supply chain for a medical device company in Boston. He'd heard through the grapevine that I'd resigned and wanted to make sure I was okay. "Dad, are you sure about this?" he asked. "You've been there forever. Longer than forever," I told him. "But it's the right time to go." "What are you going to do?" "I already know what I'm going to do. I've been planning it." He was quiet for a moment. "That sounds like you're not actually upset about this." "I'm not." I said it honestly. When you spend enough years in quality assurance, you get comfortable with the idea that systems either work the way they're supposed to or they don't. And when they don't, the documentation tells you exactly why. He didn't fully understand what I meant, but he trusted me. He always has. I registered as an independent consultant 2 days before my last day at Meridian. Regulatory Affairs and FDA Compliance Advisory Services. I had 4 clients within 3 weeks. All referrals from former colleagues who knew what I could do. My rate was $320 an hour. The math was better than my salary had been, and I didn't have to sit through any more presentations about frictionless efficiency. I set up my home office. Good chair, 2 monitors, a filing system that would make a Navy supply officer proud. Every morning I made coffee, reviewed my client files, and occasionally checked the FDA's public enforcement database. Not obsessively. More the way you check the weather when you know a storm is coming and you want to know how close it is. Day 31, after my departure, Meridian had not filed a quality director designation change with the FDA. I confirmed this through the public facility registration database. My name was still on file as the named quality director for all 3 of Meridian's commercial product licenses. This meant every batch record signed or authorized since my departure was legally problematic, not hypothetically problematic, federally problematic, under 21 CFR Part 2, 111, 22. Quality control must be performed by a qualified individual with the authority and responsibility for approving or rejecting drug products. The name designee is the documented holder of that authority. Without a valid transfer, there was no qualified individual. Without a qualified individual, there was no legitimate batch release. Meridian was shipping product. I kept working. I flew to Seattle in month 2 to help a biotech startup prepare for a pre-approval inspection. I spent 3 weeks in Chicago helping a mid-sized generics company rebuild their CAPA system after a warning letter. My son called every couple of weeks. He'd been promoted and was managing a team for the first time, asking me questions about how to handle people who don't follow procedure. I told him the same thing every time. Write it down, be consistent, and let the documented record speak for itself. Month 3, Meridian announced record earnings. Brandon gave an interview to a pharmaceutical trade publication about the company's operational transformation. He talked about eliminating redundancy, embracing digital quality management, and building a leaner organization. He used the phrase legacy overhead again. The article quoted Gerald Park praising the company's new agility. I read it over coffee and didn't feel anything in particular. I'd spent my career watching the gap between what companies said about their quality systems and what their quality systems actually were. The gap is always the interesting part. Month 4, I got a contract with a European generics company doing a market entry assessment of US manufacturers. They wanted someone who understood how FDA facility licenses actually worked, not how companies presented them. I spent 6 weeks traveling, reviewing documentation, writing reports. Good work. The kind that requires precision and doesn't forgive shortcuts. Month 5. Meridian's stock started climbing. Word got out that the company was in acquisition talks with Veltman Pharma Group, a German multinational with a US commercial presence and a strong interest in expanding their branded generics portfolio. The deal being discussed was reported at somewhere between $300 and $350 million. The financial press liked the story. Lean American manufacturer with a streamlined cost structure and strong product margins, being scooped up by a disciplined European acquirer. Brandon gave another interview. This one mentioned his strategic elimination of legacy functions as a driver of Meridian's improved EBITDA. I saved the article in a folder I labeled Record. Month 6. I got a call from an old colleague who still worked in Meridian's regulatory affairs group, one of the 4 who had survived Brandon's restructuring. He didn't say much. He just asked how I was doing, and then mentioned, carefully, that the company had recently started an internal review of batch documentation going back 18 months. He said there was some concern about certain records. He didn't elaborate. I thanked him and told him I hoped things worked out. Month 7. The Veltman due diligence team arrived at Meridian's New Jersey facility. 12 people, led by Dr. Petra Hoffman, who had spent 19 years reviewing pharmaceutical acquisitions in the US and European markets. Her team included a regulatory specialist named Thomas Reiter, who had previously worked as an FDA investigator for 8 years before moving to the private sector. Thomas Reiter was exactly the kind of person you did not want looking through your batch records if your quality director designation was out of compliance. They spent the first 2 weeks reviewing financial statements, manufacturing data, quality metrics, and customer contracts. Everything looked clean on the surface. Brandon had prepared impressive presentations. Gerald had hired a consulting firm to polish the data room. The gross margins were real. The product portfolio was solid. Veltman was optimistic. Week 3, Thomas Reiter went into the document control room to cross-reference facility registration records with personnel files. Standard procedure. He was looking for signatures, checking that the people who had signed documents were the people whose names were on file with the FDA. He was not looking for anything unusual. He found the red binder in the bottom cabinet, second drawer. Regulatory continuity for reference. Thomas opened it and spent an hour reading. Then he called Dr. Hoffman. The math she worked through that evening was not complicated, but it was severe. My FDA designation had been valid through my departure date. The 30-day window for filing a replacement had passed without any submission. My name was still the designated quality director on file for all 3 commercial product licenses. Every batch release from day 31 onward had been authorized without a valid quality director designation, making those releases non-compliant under 21 CFR Part 211.22. Because Meridian had multiple product families with different license types, the exposure extended across 2 facilities. Petra did not present this to Meridian's leadership that night. She had her team spend another 48 hours verifying everything, checking the FDA public database themselves, reviewing the quality manual, cross-referencing the date stamps on batch records. She was thorough. She had not gotten to her position by moving fast on incomplete information. Then she called an emergency meeting. I wasn't there. I learned what happened from Petra herself, weeks later, when she described the room to me in the kind of flat, precise detail that German professionals use when they're trying not to show that they are quietly appalled. Brandon was there. Gerald was there. Meridian's legal counsel and their hired quality consultant and their head of operations and their chief financial officer. Everyone who had benefited from the lean new structure sat in that conference room while Petra and Thomas laid out what they had found. Thomas opened with the regulatory framework. He explained the FDA requirement clearly, cited the CFR sections, showed the facility registration records. He explained that the named quality director designation was not a formality. He explained that batch records signed without valid authority were not simply paperwork errors, they were potentially misbranded product under federal law. Brandon said it sounded like a documentation issue that could be fixed quickly. Thomas told him it could not be fixed retroactively. Federal violations do not have an edit button. Petra then put the scope on the table. 11 months of commercial batch releases across 2 facilities. Approximately 700 individual batch records with authorization questions. Potential FDA notification obligation. Potential product recall evaluation requirement. Potential enforcement exposure. Gerald asked about the acquisition timeline. Petra told him the acquisition was suspended pending legal review. She said it clearly and without drama. A company that had been releasing pharmaceutical product for nearly a year without a validly designated quality director could not be acquired at full valuation without the acquiring entity absorbing the entirety of that regulatory liability. Veltman Pharma was not in the business of acquiring liability. They were in the business of acquiring compliant manufacturers. Brandon said they could bring me back and resolve everything. Thomas told him that did not eliminate the historical violations. It only stopped the accumulation of new ones. Gerald's face, by Petra's account, had the look of a man who had just been told that the thing he thought was an asset was actually a time bomb, and that his son-in-law had removed the warning labels. That afternoon, at 2 o'clock Eastern, Petra called me. "Mr. Webb," she said, "we have encountered a significant regulatory issue during our review of Meridian bioformulation. I understand you were previously the company's quality director. Are you able to speak?" "Yes," I told her. "I'm available." She walked me through what they had found. Precise, detailed, no editorial. When she finished, she asked me to confirm the timeline of my departure and whether any formal handoff had been executed. I gave her the dates. Restructured on day 1, resigned, effective day 41, cleared the building on day 55. I confirmed that no FDA submission had been filed to transfer my designation. When she asked whether I had attempted to document the compliance gap before leaving, I told her about the red binder. "Regulatory continuity for reference," I said. "Bottom cabinet, second drawer, in document control." "We found it," she said. "Your quality manual citation was very specific. Section 8.4.2, I told her. I wrote that provision after a consent decree case in Pennsylvania. It seemed like responsible risk management. There was a pause on her end that I recognized. It was the pause of someone who had just confirmed a theory they'd already formed. "Mr. Webb," she said, "Veltman Pharma is currently evaluating our options regarding the Meridian acquisition. We have also become aware that you are now operating as an independent consultant. Would you be open to a conversation about a potential engagement?" I looked at my client files. I looked at the window. The turnpike was moving the way it always does. "That depends on the scope," I told her. "What did you have in mind?" 3 days later, Veltman formally notified Meridian's board that the acquisition was suspended due to material regulatory findings. Their letter, which became public through Meridian's SEC disclosure obligation, cited undisclosed quality director designation violations, documentation integrity questions across 11 months of batch records, and potential misrepresentation of regulatory standing during preliminary negotiations. Meridian's stock dropped 21% before noon. It closed down 37% on the day. By Friday, it had lost 44% of its peak value from 3 months earlier, when Brandon had been giving interviews about lean operational models. The financial press had a predictable field day. One headline read, "Quality cut costs, then cost everything." Another read, "How Meridian's $340M deal disappeared in a filing cabinet." I read the coverage over coffee and felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite vindication. It was more like the feeling you get when a system behaves exactly the way it was designed to behave. The regulations exist because the consequences of pharmaceutical quality failures are not abstract. People take these medications. The documentation chains that quality professionals maintain exist because someone once decided that the stakes were too high to leave it to assumption. I had spent my career defending that idea. It turned out the idea was self-defending. The FDA opened a preliminary inquiry within 2 weeks. Not an enforcement action yet, but an inquiry. The kind that requires a company to submit corrective action plans and provide documentation of every quality decision made during the period in question. Meridian's new quality team, the 4 survivors and Jess, the coordinator, were not equipped for what that required. Gerald announced his resignation and transition to a board advisory role. The press release was careful. The board called an emergency session to discuss leadership succession and regulatory response strategy. Brandon submitted his resignation the following week. His LinkedIn status changed to reflecting and exploring new opportunities 3 days after that. One afternoon, I got an email from a personal address I didn't recognize. The message was 7 words. Hope we can connect. No hard feelings. I read it twice, confirmed the sender's identity from the email signature, and moved it to a folder I labeled documentation. Not out of malice. Documentation is habit. My son called that weekend. He'd seen the news story and connected the dots. "Dad," he said slowly, "was that you?" "I didn't do anything," I told him. "I followed procedure. So did the regulations." He was quiet for a moment. "That's the most you thing you've ever said." He wasn't wrong. Petra's engagement terms were 18 months, comprehensive review of all Veltman's North American regulatory submissions, $350 an hour with a fixed monthly retainer for availability, full autonomy over methodology. She was direct about the reason. Veltman had come close to acquiring a company in federal violation because their due diligence team had nearly missed the issue. They wanted someone who understood both how the regulations worked and how companies tried to work around them, and who could build a compliance architecture that wouldn't depend on any single person's institutional memory to survive a transition. I told her that was a solvable problem. It just required doing the work correctly the first time. She said that was exactly why she was calling me. I took the engagement. It was the most intellectually interesting work I'd done in a decade. Veltman had 12 U.S. operations, each with different FDA license histories, different state environmental permits, different quality system architectures. My job was to map all of it, identify gaps, and build a unified regulatory continuity framework that would hold up under due diligence for any future transaction. I brought my son out to visit one weekend while I was working through the documentation mapping phase. He asked me to walk him through what had happened at Meridian, the whole sequence, because his company was going through an acquisition of their own and he was worried about similar issues on the device side. We sat at my kitchen table and I walked him through it from the beginning. The designation requirement, the 30-day clock, the batch records, the binder in the cabinet, the way the due diligence team had found it. He asked good questions. His supply chain brain appreciated the logic of it. He could see how each piece connected. "You left that binder there on purpose," he said. "It wasn't just archiving. I was following our quality manual's document retention requirements," I told him. "Every controlled document has a designated archive location." He gave me the same look his mother used to give me when she thought I was being precisely, technically honest in a way that was also something else. "Dad," he said. I told him this. The binder was accurate documentation of the regulatory situation. It was placed in the correct archive location, according to company procedure. It was labeled clearly. Everything in it was factual and properly dated. I did not hide it, and I did not advertise it. I simply made sure that when a careful person looked in the right place, they would find what they needed to find. He thought about that. "So you followed every rule exactly right," he said. "And that was the thing that worked." "That's usually the thing that works," I told him. "People who don't follow rules forget that rules accumulate interest." 6 months into the Veltman engagement, I hired 2 former colleagues to help manage the workload. One had been part of my original Meridian team before Brandon's restructuring. The other was a retired FDA investigator I'd known for 15 years. We were doing substantive work, finding real issues, building real systems, the kind of thing that actually protects companies instead of just making their org charts look efficient. My son finished his first full year managing a team and called me on the anniversary of it. He said it had been harder than he expected and better than he expected in equal measure. I told him that was pretty much what competence feels like. He said he'd been thinking about regulatory compliance as a career direction and wanted my honest opinion. I told him there would always be demand for people who understood both the technical requirements and the consequences of ignoring them. I told him that the work wasn't glamorous and it wasn't loud, but it was the kind of work that mattered every day, not just on the days when something went wrong. He said his professor had actually used the Meridian case in a graduate business course, used it as an example of how operational decisions that appear to save money can create liability that dwarfs the savings. "What did the professor say the lesson was?" I asked. He said the company made the mistake of treating compliance as an expense instead of as a function, the son told me. He said you can't remove load-bearing infrastructure and expect the building to stand. I thought about Brandon clicking his wireless presenter at the front of a conference room, talking about legacy friction. I thought about Gerald in that boardroom when the Veltman team arrived, watching a $34 million deal turn into a federal inquiry in the space of one meeting. I thought about the red binder in the second drawer, waiting with the patience of a document that knows it will eventually be read. Some people in this industry spend their careers trying to be the person who gets credit when things go right. I spent mine being the person who made sure things wouldn't fail. There's a difference between those two jobs, and most organizations don't understand it until they stop paying for the second one. Meridian Bioformulation was eventually acquired, 18 months after the Veltman deal collapsed, by a private equity firm that specialized in regulatory turnaround situations. The purchase price was significantly lower than the original offer. The new owners brought in a compliance firm to rebuild the quality system from the ground up. I declined their initial inquiry. I was busy. The FDA inquiry closed with a consent decree requiring enhanced oversight and independent auditing for 3 years. The company's product recall assessment concluded that no product with verified safety data had reached patients in compromised condition, a fact that was genuinely important and that I was genuinely relieved to know. The regulatory violations were real, but the outcome for patients had been contained. That mattered. Gerald moved to Arizona. Brandon's LinkedIn profile eventually shifted from exploring new opportunities to consultant, a word that in this industry can mean many things. I did not wish him harm. I wished him, sincerely, an adequate understanding of what he didn't know. Last Thursday, I had coffee with Thomas Reiter, the former FDA investigator who had found my binder during the due diligence review. We'd stayed in contact. He was running his own consulting practice now, and we occasionally worked together on complex acquisition reviews. He asked me once whether I had anticipated exactly how things would unfold. I told him I'd anticipated that a carefully documented problem placed in the correct archive location would eventually be found by a careful person who knew where to look. He said that was a very precise answer. I told him that was the only kind of answer I knew how to give. We finished our coffee, and I drove back to my office, where 3 client files were open on my desk, and the filing system was exactly as I had left it. My son had texted that morning to say he was submitting his application to a regulatory affairs graduate program. The acceptance notification, when it came 2 weeks later, did not surprise me. The capacity for this kind of work either runs in a person or it doesn't. The work I did at Meridian, all of it, the years of documentation, the clause in the quality manual, the binder in the cabinet was not unusual. It was just the job, done correctly. The unusual part was that someone decided the job was unnecessary. Brandon had called quality assurance legacy overhead. He'd meant it as a criticism, but he was accidentally right. Legacy, in engineering and in pharmaceutical manufacturing, means something that has survived because it works. The overhead is the price of not finding out the hard way what happens when it's gone. 11 months and 3 days was apparently how long it took to find out. Business is good, better than good. It just cost somebody $340 million to prove what I already knew.